The gleaming spires of the Vanguard Academy hung suspended against the backdrop of stars, its orbital rings rotating in perfect harmony around the neutral star of Proxima Centauri. Inside the polished halls of the most prestigious military institution in the Seven Systems, cadets from a dozen species moved with practiced precision, their uniforms bearing the insignia of their home planets alongside the universal emblem of the Vanguard. Among them, Cadet Nira Solon walked with her chin high, her scaled blue skin catching the artificial light as she made her way to advanced tactical studies. The young Threxian's reputation preceded her, youngest ever recipient of the Tactical Excellence Medal, descendant of 5 generations of war heroes, and currently ranked first in her class for strategic simulation scores. The weight of her people's expectations rested comfortably on her shoulders, a burden she had carried since childhood. "Solon!" called a voice from behind. "Wait up!" Nira turned to see Lieutenant Merrick Jha jogging toward her, his lanky form weaving between clusters of cadets. As her closest friend at the academy and a fellow third year, Merrick shared most of her classes despite being from the gaseous planet of Vorn, his translucent skin revealing the swirling currents of his internal circulation. "You've heard about the new program?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "The Earth Archives?" Nira nodded. "Commander Arvix mentioned it last week. Raw footage from human conflicts, I believe." Merrick's skin pulsed with excitement, a Vornian expression of anticipation. "Not just footage, full sensory archives. They're saying it's unprecedented. Complete neural recordings from Earth's wars, spanning their 20th and 21st centuries. The Trade Council finally authorized the exchange." Nira's inner eyelids flickered with interest. Threxians valued knowledge of all combat forms, and Earth's unique brand of warfare, primitive yet innovative, had long been a subject of academic curiosity. Humans were a relatively isolated species, their planet a protected developmental zone under the Galactic Accords. Their warfare, conducted without quantum shielding or consciousness transfers, represented a raw, visceral approach to combat that most advanced civilizations had long abandoned. "Will we be permitted to view them?" she asked. "Better than that," Merrick replied. "The Academy's holding special sessions in the multi-species holotheaters. Volunteers only, of course. They're warning about psychological impact, but think of the tactical insights. Pure, unfiltered human combat strategies." The Academy bells chimed, signaling 5 minutes until the next instruction period. "When do they start?" Nira quickened her pace. "Tomorrow. First session is on something called Stalingrad. They're looking for 20 volunteers from our year." Nira's mouth curved into the subtle Threxian smile that few non-Threxians could recognize. "I'll be there." The holotheater was smaller than Nira had expected. A circular chamber with 20 neural interface chairs, arranged in a perfect ring. The walls were lined with medical monitoring equipment, and a team of technicians worked at control panels beneath the watchful eyes of Commander Arvix, a veteran Threxian whose scale patterns had faded to pale gray with age. "Cadets," Arvix addressed them, her voice carrying the distinctive metallic undertone of someone who had commanded troops in battle. "What you are about to experience is not a simulation. These are actual neural recordings, captured by human historians during what they call the Battle of Stalingrad in their Second World War." Nira settled into her assigned chair, noting that Merrick had claimed the one to her right. On her left sat Cadet Ray Kor, a cephalian whose tentacled head was already fitted with adaptive neural connectors. Ray had been Nira's chief rival since their first year, consistently placing second in tactical exercises. "The neural crowns will allow you to experience these memories as if you were present," continued Arvix. "You will feel cold, hunger, fear, all sensations recorded by the human observers. Remember your training. These are not your emotions, merely data to be analyzed for tactical insight." Dr. Salia Bren, the Academy's chief psychologist, stepped forward. The Lumerian's bioluminescent skin cast a soft blue glow as she spoke. "I must emphasize that what you are about to experience is considered traumatic, even by human standards," she said. "You may disengage at any time by pressing the red button on your right armrest. There is no shame in this. Different species process different stimuli in unique ways." Nira noticed several cadets shift uncomfortably in their seats. Weakness, she thought. Her people had conquered 3 star systems through unwavering resolve. She would not dishonor them by flinching from mere historical records. "Neural crowns activating in 3, 2, 1, announced a technician. The crown descended over Nira's head, its cool metal prongs making contact with her scale-covered skull. For a moment, there was only darkness and the faint hum of machinery. Then, cold. Bone-deep, breath-stealing cold that made her scales contract painfully against her skin. The darkness gave way to a blinding whiteness. Snow, she realized, stretching across a devastated urban landscape. Buildings stood as broken teeth against a gray sky, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The sensory input was overwhelming. The stench of rotting flesh and burning oil. The distant crack of weapons fire. The gnawing emptiness of hunger in a stomach that wasn't hers. Yet somehow was. She was seeing through human eyes, feeling through human nerves. A Russian war correspondent named Victor, according to the brief mental imprint that accompanied the memory. She was moving through rubble, following soldiers whose breath clouded the air. Their uniforms were caked with filth, their faces gaunt beneath frost-covered scarves. One man slumped against a wall, his leg a mangled mess of flesh and bone. He was making a sound, a keening wail that Nira had never heard in any simulation. "Push forward!" shouted a voice in a language she shouldn't understand, but somehow did. The neural interface translating as it fed her the memory. Germans on the eastern flank. Gunfire erupted, deafeningly close. Nira instinctively tried to activate her defensive scales. But nothing happened. She was trapped in a human body with human vulnerabilities. A soldier fell beside her, blood blossoming across the snow in a pattern that reminded her of Threxian ceremonial ink. His eyes remained open, staring skyward with a vacancy that triggered something primal in Nira's mind. Then came the artillery. The ground itself seemed to scream as shells tore into the frozen earth. Bodies flew apart. A building collapsed, burying a squad of soldiers beneath tons of concrete and steel. She could hear them calling for help beneath the rubble, their voices growing weaker as minutes stretched into hours. Night fell, and still the fighting continued. Through Victor's eyes, she witnessed soldiers hacking frozen flesh from dead horses to stave off starvation. She felt the correspondent's horror and his shame at documenting rather than intervening, as a wounded soldier begged to be finished off, his entrails steaming in the winter air. The neural feed jumped forward. Days passed in moments. The city became a labyrinth of death. Snipers picked off water carriers. Children were used as bait for booby traps. 2 armies ground each other to dust in a conflict where victory seemed measured only in who would be the last to die. When the neural crown finally lifted, Nira found herself gasping, her claws extended and embedded in the chair's armrests. The hollow theater light seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of Stalingrad. Around her, other cadets were in various states of distress. A Meridian had vomited luminescent fluid onto the floor. 2 others had already vacated their chairs. Merrick's translucent skin had gone completely cloudy, the Vornian equivalent of shock. Only Ray appeared composed, though her tentacles were coiled tightly against her head, a sign of intense concentration or distress. "First impressions, cadets?" Commander Arvik's voice sounded distant despite her standing only meters away. No one spoke. Nira found herself struggling to process what she had witnessed. The Academy's combat simulations were sanitized, focused on movement and strategy rather than suffering. Nothing had prepared her for the raw animal panic of humans, fighting for survival with primitive weapons. "Cadet Solon, Arvix singled her out. Your analysis? Nira straightened. Military discipline taking over. Inefficient. Commander. The human forces lacked proper evacuation protocols for wounded, resulting in unnecessary resource expenditure on non-viable combatants. The words tasted wrong in her mouth, clinical and hollow against the memory of those eyes in the snow. Arvix nodded approvingly. Continue. The urban terrain was inadequately mapped before engagement. Both forces suffered from exposure and supply chain vulnerabilities that could have been mitigated with proper— Nira paused. The image of starving soldiers cutting flesh from corpses flashing in her mind. With proper planning, she finished. Very good, said Arvix. This is precisely the value of these archives. We learn from the primitive tactics of less advanced species to refine our own approaches. Dr. Bren stepped forward. Her luminescence dimmed to a concerned glow. I suggest we end today's session here. The neural impact readings are concerning for several cadets. Arvix's scales rippled with mild irritation. We've scheduled 3 hours. And we'll reconvene tomorrow, Bren countered firmly. These neural patterns need time to integrate. Pushing further could create lasting trauma imprints. After a moment's consideration, Arvix relented. Very well, cadets. You are dismissed. Reflect on what you've learned. Tomorrow we examine a conflict called the Somme. As the cadets filed out, Nira found herself unable to engage in the usual post-simulation discussion. Merrick walked beside her in similar silence, his circulation patterns erratic beneath his skin. That was, he finally said as they reached the dormitory level. Informative, Nira supplied automatically. Merrick's outer membrane rippled, the equivalent of a human snort. Is that what we're calling it? Did you feel the correspondence fear when the building collapsed? It was just sensory data, Nira said, reciting Academy doctrine. Emotional responses are irrelevant to tactical analysis. Right, Merrick said, unconvinced. See you tomorrow, then? Nira hesitated, then nodded. Of course, it's valuable intelligence. But as she entered her quarters and removed her uniform, Nira found herself standing motionless before the cleansing chamber, seeing not her reflection, but the face of that soldier in the snow, eyes fixed on a sky he would never see again. The second day brought fewer volunteers. Only 15 chairs were filled, as Commander Arvix explained the context for the Somme, a battle from Earth's First World War, involving trench warfare and what humans called chemical weapons. Nira took her seat with determination. Yesterday's discomfort was a weakness she would overcome, a test of her resolve as a future officer. Merrick settled beside her. Though his circulation appeared sluggish, he had likely spent the night in meditation to clear the neural imprints. Cadet Solon, Ray acknowledged her from the adjacent chair, tentacles rippling in the formal Cephalian greeting. You seemed affected yesterday. Merely processing new tactical information, Nira replied stiffly. Ray's compound eyes studied her. Of course, though I found the human emotional imprints unexpectedly potent. Their fear responses operate on frequencies similar to Cephalian distress signals. Before Nira could respond, the neural crowns descended. This time, she was prepared for the sensory onslaught, but nothing could have readied her for the Somme. The memory belonged to a human medic named James, stationed behind British lines. Through his eyes, she watched waves of men climb from trenches into a hurricane of machine gun fire, their bodies jerking like puppets as bullets tore through them. The ground between opposing trenches, no man's land, they called it, became carpeted with corpses that lay exposed to the elements for days, weeks, decomposing in full view of those still living. Then came the gas. Yellow-green clouds that rolled across the battlefield, sinking into the trenches where men clawed at their throats, their eyes bulging as their lungs dissolved. James worked frantically, helplessly, among rows of the dying, their skin blistered, their breathing reduced to wet, desperate rasps. The memory jumped forward to a field hospital, a blood-soaked tent, where limbs were sawed off without anesthesia, where men sobbed for their mothers, where the floor grew slick with fluids both medical and human. James worked for 36 hours straight, his hands trembling with exhaustion as he separated the dying from those who might be saved. Throughout it all, Nira felt James's mounting horror, not just at what was happening to these men, but at the realization that this was not an aberration, but the new face of war. Millions dying for meters of mud, poison turning the very air into a weapon, technology creating efficient new methods of slaughter, while medicine struggled to keep pace. When the neural crown lifted, Nira found 3 cadets already gone, their chairs empty. Another was being attended to by medical staff, his carapace plates clicking rapidly in species-specific shock. Merrick remained, but his circulation had gone completely still, a Vornian meditative defense mechanism. Ray's tentacles were writhing independently, a sign of severe neural distress despite her composed facial features. Commander Arvik stood before them, apparently unmoved. Observations? Nira's mouth felt dry. The gas weapons were indiscriminate, tactically inefficient for targeted operations, yet effective for area denial and psychological impact, Arvix noted. Continue. The casualty rates were disproportionate to territorial gains, Nira managed, struggling to maintain her analytical perspective. Resources were expended without strategic advantage. And yet humans continued this pattern throughout their history, Arvik said. Why? Cadet Solon. Nira had no answer that satisfied both her training and the visceral understanding James's memories had imparted. I require additional context, Commander. Dr. Bren intervened, her luminescence pulsing with concern. The neural readings are exceeding safety parameters for half the remaining cadets. I strongly recommend we end today's session. This time, Arvix did not argue. Dismissed. Those continuing with the program will report tomorrow for Dresden. In the corridor outside, Merrick finally emerged from his meditative state. I can't do another, he said, his voice barely audible. The way they died, Nira. Not like our simulations. Not like anything we've trained for. It's historical data, Nira insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to her. Primitive warfare from a less advanced species. Is it? Merrick's inner circulation formed patterns of distress. They felt pain just as we do, feared death just as we do, loved their comrades just as we do. What makes their suffering primitive? Their tactics, Nira replied automatically. Their technology. Their failure to evolve beyond... Beyond what? Merrick interrupted. Beyond feeling? Beyond caring what happens to their wounded? I saw compassion in that medic's memories. Nira. More than I've seen in some of our tactical exercises. Nira felt a flare of defensive anger. Are you questioning the Academy's methods? I'm questioning what we're learning here. Merrick's skin clouded again. I won't be at tomorrow's session. I've already submitted my withdrawal. He left her standing alone, surrounded by cadets discussing the day's lesson in hushed, troubled tones. That night, Nira dreamed of gas clouds seeping beneath her door, of mud-filled trenches stretching through the Academy's polished halls, of Commander Arvix ordering waves of cadets over the top, while she observed from a safe distance. She woke gasping. Her scales flared in a defensive posture against enemies that weren't there. By the third day, only 8 cadets remained in the program. Nira took her seat with grim determination, noting that Ray had also returned. The Cephalian nodded to her with what might have been respect or concern. Today's archive documents the bombing of Dresden, announced Commander Arvix. A civilian population center targeted for strategic purposes during Earth's Second World War. Dr. Bren looked troubled. Commander, The psychological impact ratings for this archive are significantly higher than previous sessions. The subject matter involves, "We are training military officers." Doctor. Arvix cut her off. "Not hospitality staff. These cadets have volunteered to understand the realities of warfare." The neural crowns descended. This time, Nira experienced the memory of a civilian, a human female named Elise, perhaps 16 years old in their development cycle. She was in an underground shelter with her family when the bombing began. The sound alone was traumatic, a continuous, world-ending roar as thousands of explosive devices fell from aircraft above. When they emerged, the city was transformed. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to skeletal frames. The air itself was fire, a storm of heat so intense it created its own weather system, sucking oxygen from shelters and incinerating those who fled into the streets. Through Elise's eyes, Nira watched a woman carrying a bundle try to run across a square, only to be caught in a downdraft of flame. The bundle, a child, fell from her arms as her clothing ignited. Elise and her family joined a procession of refugees, walking past corpses, charred beyond recognition, past people whose skin hung in sheets from radiation burns, past a park where bodies had been stacked like cordwood because there was nowhere else to put them. The memory continued for days as Elise searched for missing relatives among makeshift hospitals and registration centers. The smell of burned flesh never left the air. The sound of distant bombing never fully ceased. Food and water became precious commodities, fought over with the desperation of those who had lost everything else. When the neural crown lifted, Nira found herself trembling. 3 more cadets had left during the session. Only 5 remained, including Ray, whose tentacles were now completely still, a sign of profound cephalian distress. "Tactical assessment?" Commander Arvix prompted. No one spoke. "Cadet Solon?" Nira struggled to find words that wouldn't betray the turmoil in her mind. The bombing achieved its strategic objective of disrupting enemy movement and infrastructure. At what cost? The question came not from Arvix but from Ray, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Civilian casualties are an unfortunate consequence of strategic necessity," Arvix answered for Nira. "This has been consistent throughout military history across all species." "But the scale," Ray persisted. "The deliberate targeting of non-combatants provided valuable data on urban firestorm dynamics," Arvix finished coldly. "Data that informed later military developments across human history." Nira found herself speaking before she could stop the words. The girl, Elise, she never understood why. Even years later, in the memory's conclusion, she never comprehended the strategic necessity that destroyed her home. "Understanding is not required for strategic effectiveness," Arvix stated. "Only compliance." The words hung in the air, settling over the remaining cadets like the ash that had fallen on Dresden. "Tomorrow," Arvix continued, "we examine Vietnam and the development of chemical defoliants in jungle warfare." As they filed out, Nira noticed Dr. Bren watching her with concern, the Lumarian's bioluminescence pulsing in patterns that suggested she wanted to speak privately. Nira avoided her gaze and quickened her pace. In the corridor, Ray fell into step beside her. "You're questioning," the Cephalian observed. "I'm analyzing," Nira corrected stiffly. "As am I." Ray's tentacles moved in a pattern Nira had never seen before. Not aggression or dominance, but something more complex. "These archives are changing my understanding of effective warfare." "How so?" Nira asked, despite herself. "I always believed the goal of war was victory at minimum cost," Ray said. "But these human conflicts suggest another pattern, one where victory itself becomes hollow, beyond a certain threshold of suffering." The observation disturbed Nira more than she wanted to admit. "The Academy teaches that all suffering in war is justified by the peace that follows." "Does it?" Ray's compound eyes fixed on her. Then why are we not viewing the peace that followed these human conflicts? Why only the suffering? Nira had no answer. That night, she accessed the Academy's historical databases, searching for information on post-war Earth. The records were surprisingly sparse, focusing on military developments rather than social outcomes. Nothing about Elisa's life after Dresden. Nothing about what happened to the soldiers at Stalingrad who survived. Nothing about the medic James, and whether he ever recovered from what he had witnessed. It was as if the Academy was interested only in how humans died in war, not how they lived with its aftermath. The Vietnam archive was worse. Through the eyes of a helicopter pilot named Michael, Nira witnessed forests dissolving under chemical spray, villages burning as terrified civilians fled, children screaming as napalm adhered to their skin and continued burning through flesh to bone. She felt Michael's initial belief in his mission crumble under the weight of what he was ordered to do. Felt his horror when discovering a village where his unit had been told there were only enemy combatants, but where they found afterward the bodies of elderly people, pregnant women, children. The memory jumped forward to Michael's return to his home country, where he was spat upon by some civilians and ignored by others, where nightmares left him screaming in the dark, where the government that had sent him to war now seemed indifferent to his suffering. Only 3 cadets remained when the neural crown lifted. Ray had finally withdrawn, leaving only Nira and 2 others, whom she barely knew. A Meridian, whose light processing organs had dimmed to near darkness, and a silicon-based terramorph, whose crystalline structure showed stress fractures. "Observations?" Arvix prompted, as always. Nira said nothing. "Cadet Solon, your analysis is required." "What is the purpose of this program, Commander?" Nira asked instead. Arvix's scales flattened in irritation. "To understand warfare in its rawest form, unfiltered by simulation parameters. To prepare you for the realities of command." "These are not military lessons," Nira said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "These are atrocities. War is atrocity, Cadet. Controlled, directed atrocity in service to strategic objectives." "Is that what we're learning to control? To direct?" Nira stood from her chair, a breach of protocol that caused Arvix's scales to flare in warning. "Or are we learning to normalize it, to accept it as inevitable?" "You forget yourself, Cadet." Arvix's voice dropped dangerously. "This program is voluntary. If you find it disturbing, you may withdraw at any time. Like the others have. Like Merrick, who hasn't left his quarters in 2 days. Like Ray, whose neural patterns were showing damage according to Dr. Bren's monitors. Weakness," Arvix dismissed. "Unsuitability for command." "Or clarity," Nira countered. "The clarity to recognize that what we're viewing isn't a tactical database, but a warning." The Meridian and Terramorph were watching the exchange with visible discomfort. Dr. Bren had entered the holotheater, her luminescence bright with alarm. "You are dismissed, Cadet Solon," Arvix said coldly. "Report to psychological evaluation before returning to regular duties." Nira hesitated, then walked stiffly from the holotheater, her mind churning with images from 4 days of human memory, not just the horror and death, but the moments of compassion amid chaos, the bonds between those suffering together, the questioning that came afterward when survivors tried to make sense of what they had experienced. Dr. Bren caught up with her in the corridor. "Cadet Solon, I'd like to speak with you privately." Nira followed the Lumerian to a small office, where the lights automatically dimmed to accommodate Bren's natural bioluminescence. "Your neural readings have been concerning," Bren said, once they were seated. "You're experiencing empathic resonance with the human subjects at levels rarely seen in Threxians." "Is that a defect?" Nira asked numbly. "On the contrary." Bren's luminescence formed patterns that indicated sincerity. "It suggests an unusual capacity for cross-species understanding, but it also places you at higher risk for trauma imprinting." "The program continues tomorrow," Nira said. "Something called Hiroshima." Dr. Bren's light dimmed noticeably. Yes. The first deployment of atomic weapons against a civilian population. You've experienced these archives yourself? All Academy staff involved in the program were required to. It's why I've been monitoring so closely. Bren's light pulsed in a pattern that Nira recognized as regret. The neural impact is significant. Yet Commander Arvix seems unaffected. Commander Arvix experienced actual combat during the Threxian-Vornian conflict, Bren said carefully. Her neural pathways process traumatic input differently as a result. She's desensitized, Nira translated. Bren didn't confirm or deny this. Instead, she asked, "Will you continue with the program?" Nira considered the question seriously. The easy path would be withdrawal, joining Merrick, Ray, and the others who had recognized their limits and stepped back. But something drove her forward. Some need to understand what these human memories were revealing, not just about Earth's history, but about warfare itself. Yes, she decided. I need to see it through. Then I'll authorize neural stabilizers, Bren said. They won't block the experience, but they may help prevent permanent imprinting. As Nira left the office, she found herself wondering if prevention was the right approach. Perhaps some experiences should leave permanent marks. Only Nira arrived for the fifth-day session. The Meridian and Terramorph had submitted withdrawal notices overnight, citing neural strain. Commander Arvix seemed unsurprised, her aged scales lying flat against her skull in an expression of grim satisfaction. Hiroshima, she announced without preamble. August 6, 1945, by the human calendar. The deployment of the first atomic weapon against an enemy population center. Dr. Bren administered the neural stabilizer, a cool mist that Nira inhaled deeply, feeling it spread through her system with a tingling sensation. This will modulate your response, the doctor explained. But the experience itself will remain intact. The neural crown descended. The memory belonged to a human named Akiko, a young female who had been walking to a distribution center when the world went white. The flash itself was beyond description, a light so absolute it seemed to penetrate not just eyes, but skin, bone, the very essence of being. Then came the heat, a wall of it, displacing air, incinerating everything in its path. Akiko survived only because she had been in the shadow of a concrete wall, which took the initial blast. What followed was chaos beyond anything Nira had yet experienced in the archives. People whose skin hung in ribbons from radiation burns. Others, seemingly unmarked, but vomiting blood as their internal organs failed. Children crying beside the charred remains of parents. The city transformed into an alien landscape of twisted metal and ash. Landmarks erased as if they had never existed. Through Akiko's eyes, Nira witnessed the aftermath unfold over days, weeks, months, the slow deaths from radiation poisoning, the birth defects in the next generation, the cancers that appeared years later, and through it all, the questions that no strategic assessment could answer. Why civilians? Why an entire city? What purpose was served by such complete destruction? When the neural crown lifted, Nira found her face wet with tears, a physiological response so rare in Threxians that she had never experienced it before. Commander Arvix watched her with an unreadable expression. Your assessment, Cadet? Nira rose from the chair, removed her uniform jacket with its Academy insignia, and placed it carefully on the seat. Cadet Solon, explain yourself, Arvix demanded. I resign my position at the Vanguard Academy, Nira said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. Effective immediately. Arvix's scales darkened with anger. This is a childish reaction to difficult material. You will return to your seat and complete your assessment. No, Commander. Nira stood her ground. I have completed my assessment, not just of human warfare, but of what we're doing here, studying methods of killing as if they were academic exercises, divorced from their consequences. That is precisely what military training requires, Arvik snapped. The ability to make strategic decisions without emotional interference. Is it? Nira challenged. Or is it what creates commanders who order bombing raids on civilian targets? Who deploy chemical weapons against refugee columns? Who measure victory in body counts, rather than in lives preserved? Dr. Bren had entered the holotheater, her luminescence bright with alarm or perhaps approval. Nira couldn't tell which. You are throwing away a promising career, Arvix warned. 5 generations of your family have served with distinction. And I will serve differently, Nira replied. Not by learning to kill more efficiently, but by understanding what these human archives are really teaching us. That there is a point beyond which warfare becomes not a means to peace, but an end to everything of value. Naive idealism. Arvix dismissed. Humans were a primitive species who allowed emotion to cloud strategic judgment. They were a species who documented their worst moments so that others might learn from them. Nira countered. Not just tactics and technology, but the true cost of victory at any price. I've learned that lesson, Commander, have you? Without waiting for a response, Nira walked from the holotheater, leaving behind her uniform jacket and the future it represented. The formal resignation process took 3 days, forms to complete, interviews with academy counselors, a final meeting with the commandant, who seemed genuinely puzzled by her decision. Through it all, Nira maintained a calm resolve, even as news of her resignation spread through the academy like wildfire. She was packing her few personal belongings when Commander Arvix appeared at her door. You've caused quite the disruption, the older Threxian said without preamble. 4 more cadets have resigned in the past 2 days, citing your example. I didn't ask them to follow me, Nira replied. Yet they have. Arvix entered the room uninvited, her gaze taking in the half-packed containers. Where will you go? Back to Threxia Prime in disgrace? To the frontier colonies, Nira said. The Humanitarian Corps is accepting volunteers with military training. Arvix's scales rippled with what might have been amusement or scorn. To bind wounds instead of causing them? A waste of your tactical mind. Is preventing suffering less valuable than inflicting it efficiently? In war, yes. Arvix moved closer, her voice dropping. The galaxy is not the peaceful federation our political leaders pretend. There are threats beyond our borders that would annihilate us without the protection of officers like those we train here. I don't dispute the need for defense, Nira said carefully. Only the way we prepare for it. Those human archives showed us what happens when military necessity becomes the only consideration. When strategic objectives override all ethical constraints. Ethics are a luxury of peace, Arvix countered. In war, there is only survival. The humans in those memories were fighting for survival too, Nira pointed out. Yet, even in their darkest moments, some maintained their humanity. Medics, who treated enemy wounded. Soldiers who shared rations with civilian refugees. Officers who questioned orders that crossed moral lines. And they lost wars because of such sentimentality. Did they? Nira shook her head. The archives don't show us who ultimately won these conflicts, Commander. They show us what victory cost, and whether the price was worth paying. Arvix studied her for a long moment. You were my most promising student, she finally said. I had hoped you would eventually take my place here. Teaching others to view atrocity as strategy? Nira closed her travel case with a decisive click. I will serve elsewhere. As Arvix turned to leave, she paused at the door. The final archive, the one scheduled for tomorrow, was different from the others. It showed the aftermath of a peace agreement, brokered after decades of conflict. Perhaps you should have stayed for that lesson as well. Perhaps you should have started with it, Nira replied. Before showing us all the ways humans found to destroy each other, you might have shown us that they ultimately chose another path. After Arvix left, Nira, sat on her bare sleeping platform, thinking about the human memories that now lived inside her mind. Not just the horror and death, but the moments of connection, of sacrifice, of questioning that seemed to persist, even in the darkest circumstances. She wondered what Akiko's life had been like after Hiroshima. Whether James had found peace after the Somme, whether Victor had survived Stalingrad to tell his story. The humans in these memories hadn't been tacticians analyzing battle efficiency. They had been people caught in events beyond their control, trying to maintain their essential humanity, even as the world burned around them. That, Nira realized, was the lesson the Academy had never taught. That behind every strategic decision were lives altered forever, and that true service meant remembering this cost in every action taken. 6 months later, Nira stood on the medical platform of Outpost Helios, a frontier colony on the edge of charted space. As senior medical coordinator for the Humanitarian Corps, she oversaw a team of 20 volunteers from various species, providing care to colonists and indigenous life forms alike. The work was grueling, but fulfilling. Not the glory her family had envisioned for her, but service of a different kind. She had written to her parents only once, explaining her decision without expecting understanding. Their reply had been brief, but not entirely condemnatory. Serve with honor, whatever path you choose. She was treating a Meridian child with atmospheric adaptation issues when the facility's communication system chimed. "Incoming transport requesting emergency medical clearance," announced the automated system. "Multiple casualties aboard." Nira moved quickly to the receiving bay, organizing her team as the transport specifications appeared on the monitoring screens. It was an Academy vessel, a training ship that had encountered a spatial anomaly during routine exercises. As the wounded were brought in, cadets with radiation burns, internal injuries, trauma consistent with sudden decompression, Nira worked methodically, her training finding new purpose in preservation rather than destruction. "Cadet Solon," a voice said from behind her. She turned to find Ray Kor on a gurney, the cephalian's tentacles damaged, but her compound eyes alert. "Medical Coordinator Solon now," Nira corrected gently, scanning Ray's injuries. "What happened?" "Training exercise gone wrong," Ray explained, as Nira applied regenerative gel to her damaged tissues. "We were mapping the anomaly when the shields failed. The instructors pushed us into escape pods, but they stayed behind to manually pilot the ship away from the colony." "The instructors survived?" Ray's tentacles moved in a pattern of uncertainty. "Unknown. The ship's communication systems were damaged in the initial event." Nira continued her treatment in silence. Noting that the Academy's training had served these cadets well in crisis, they had maintained discipline, helped one another, prioritized civilian safety over their own. Later, as she was completing her treatment logs, a figure appeared in the doorway of the medical office, Commander Arvix, her uniform scorched and one arm immobilized in a pressure cast. "Commander," Nira acknowledged, rising from her desk. "I wasn't informed you were among the wounded." "I declined priority treatment," Arvix said, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. "The cadets came first." Nira gestured to a treatment chair. "Your arm needs proper cellular regeneration." As she worked on Arvix's injuries, the commander studied her with those same inscrutable eyes. "You've found your place, it seems." "As have you," Nira observed. "Protecting your cadets at risk to yourself. Not what I would have expected from our discussions of strategic necessity." Arvix's scales shifted in what might have been discomfort or amusement. "Perhaps I've had time to reconsider certain principles since your departure." "The final archive?" Nira guessed. "Among other things." Arvix winced as the regenerative field activated around her damaged arm. "Your resignation created quite the ripple effect. The Academy Council reviewed the Neural Archive program. They've modified its implementation." "How so?" "Context," Arvix said simply. The archives are now presented as a complete historical record, not just the conflicts themselves, but their causes and aftermath. The human capacity for both destruction and reconstruction. Nira continued her work in silence, absorbing this information. "The cadets speak of you," Arvix added. "Your resignation has become something of a legend, the top tactical student who chose healing over warfare." "I didn't resign to become a legend," Nira said. "I resigned because I couldn't reconcile what I was learning with what I was being taught. And now—" Nira finished the treatment, checking the cellular alignment before disengaging the field. "Now, I understand that there are many ways to serve. The Academy prepares defenders, necessary ones. But defense means more than tactical superiority. It means preserving what makes peace worth achieving." Arvix stood, testing her partially healed arm. "Your team performed admirably today. The Academy would benefit from such training." "Are you offering me my position back, Commander?" "I'm suggesting a collaboration," Arvix clarified. "A rotation of Academy cadets through humanitarian corps assignments, with your team providing instruction in medical and preservation protocols." Nira considered the proposal. "So that future officers understand not just how to win conflicts, but how to minimize their cost." "Precisely." Arvix's scales settled into a pattern that Nira recognized as respectful acknowledgement, a rare gesture from a superior to a former subordinate. What we learn from human history should not be limited to their methods of warfare, but should include their journey toward something better. As Arvix prepared to leave, she paused. "The Humanitarian Corps has submitted your name for the Galactic Service Medal. I've added my endorsement." After the commander departed, Nira returned to the treatment ward, where the injured cadets were recovering. Among them, Ray was engaged in animated discussion with two Threxian cadets who were listening with unusual attention to a Cephalian. "Tactical brilliance isn't enough," Ray was saying. "The neural archives taught us that victory without preservation is ultimately hollow. Coordinator Solon understood this before any of us." Nira moved quietly among the patients, checking monitors and adjusting treatments, listening as the cadets debated the purpose of military service, the definition of victory, the meaning of duty. In their voices, questioning, passionate, thoughtful, she heard echoes of Akiko, James, Victor, Elise, Michael. Humans who had experienced the worst of warfare and still searched for something better. Their memories lived on, not just in the Academy's archives, but in the minds of those who had experienced them. Memories that might, perhaps, help guide a different future. As night fell over the colony, Nira stood at the observation window, watching distant stars and thinking of Earth, a planet she would never visit but whose painful lessons had altered the course of her life. Somewhere in that distant system, humans were still working to reconcile their capacity for both destruction and compassion, still learning from their own history. And here, on the edge of known space, their memories continued to teach, not just how wars were fought, but why peace was worth the harder, longer struggle to achieve.